At 3:47 in the morning, the doors of the Apostolic Palace closed under direct papal authority. Swiss guards took control of every exit, and the cardinals inside were ordered not to leave the building, the city, or their private quarters. The command had not come from a security officer or a Vatican administrator. It had come from Pope Leo XIV. Only hours earlier, he had signed a decree capable of breaking the most powerful alliances inside the Catholic Church. 14 cardinals were about to lose their authority. 25 years of Vatican financial records were about to be opened, and a system built on silence was about to face public scrutiny. No official announcement had prepared the world for what was happening behind the sealed doors. To understand why the Vatican reached that point, the story had to return 48 hours to one telephone call and 700 pages of financial evidence. On May 13, 2026, Pope Leo XIV was working in his study on the third floor of the Domus Sanctae Marthae. He had remained there since his election on May 8th of the previous year, refusing to move into the grand papal apartments because he believed the space was too large for one man. His critics called the decision a performance of humility, while his allies insisted that he meant every word. That morning, the quiet of the room ended with a telephone call from Cardinal Matteo Bruni, prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Bruni's voice was strained as he explained that an anonymous courier had delivered a package directly to his office. Inside were 700 pages of internal financial records covering 2 decades, including bank statements, wire transfers, and documents connected to shell companies registered in Panama, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. Every record pointed toward the same network of senior Vatican officials who had been diverting church funds into private accounts since 2004. Leo listened without interrupting, then asked only one question. "How many names?" Bruni paused before answering. 14 cardinals appeared in the documents, and 3 of them were already inside the same building as the Pope. The information changed the direction of the next 72 hours before either man ended the call. Leo ordered Bruni to secure every page inside the Apostolic Archive under the Pope's personal seal and to speak to no one about what had arrived. After ending the call with Cardinal Matteo Bruni, Pope Leo XIV immediately placed a second call. This one went to Sister Mariana Vega, a canon lawyer from Buenos Aires, who had been quietly advising him on internal reform since December of 2025. Outside Vatican circles, her name carried little public recognition. Inside those walls, officials knew her as meticulous, relentless, and unwilling to protect institutional loyalty when it interfered with justice. Sister Vega reached the Domus Sanctae Marthae within the hour and was taken directly to the Pope's study. Leo remained behind the small wooden desk where he wrote his daily reflections by hand, then slid a single sheet across the surface toward her. The page contained 14 names, each connected to the financial documents that had arrived earlier that day. She read the list slowly, allowing her eyes to stop on each name before moving to the next. When she finally looked up, the weight of the list had become personal. "Some of these men ordained me," she said. Leo did not soften his response. "And some of these men stole from the poorest parishes on earth. Which fact matters more?" Sister Vega gave no answer, because the answer was already present on the page between them. The men named there were not distant administrators or abstract entries in an investigation. They were senior figures, shaped by the same hierarchy that had formed her own vocation and authority. By the time she left the desk, the matter had moved beyond a financial review and into a direct confrontation with the internal loyalties of the Church. By the morning of May 14th, Pope Leo XIV had assembled a team of only 6 people, He had no intention of widening the circle before the evidence was secured and the first decisions were made. Previous reform efforts had taught him how quickly information moved through the Vatican once too many offices became involved. This investigation would begin with discipline, silence, and a chain of responsibility small enough to control. The team included Cardinal Matteo Bruni and Sister Mariana Vega, along with 2 officers from the Swiss Guard assigned to protect the documents and the people examining them. Leo also brought in Luca Ferretti, a forensic accountant from Milan who had previously worked with the International Criminal Police Organization. The final member was Archbishop Thomas Kwame, Ansa of Ghana, the official responsible for the Vatican's Internal Audit Office. For years, Ansa had been identifying financial irregularities that senior officials had repeatedly declined to pursue. They met in a basement room beneath the Vatican Library, away from the offices where assistants, secretaries, and senior administrators moved through the normal workday. Most Vatican employees did not know the room existed. During the Second World War, it had been used to protect priceless manuscripts from bombing raids. On May 14th, its thick walls were being used to contain evidence that could damage the authority of men at the highest levels of the Church. Ferretti placed the financial documents across a long oak table and began arranging them by account, jurisdiction, date, and recipient. Bank statements were separated from wire transfer records, while the shell company documents were aligned with the names and signatures connected to them. The 2 Swiss Guard officers remained near the entrance, as Bruni, Vega, and Ansa followed the movement of money across the table. What had arrived as an anonymous package was becoming a map of an organized financial system. As Luca Ferretti worked through the records, the scale of the operation became impossible to dismiss. More than 400 million euros had been diverted across 20 years through a web of intermediary accounts. The transfers were repeatedly kept just below reporting thresholds and routed through jurisdictions where oversight was weak. The pattern changed from account to account, but the method remained consistent, and the signatures attached to the transactions were real. The most damaging discovery concerned Peter's Pence, the annual collection gathered from Catholic parishes around the world. Much of that money had been donated by ordinary believers, including people in developing countries who gave from communities already struggling to meet basic needs. The funds had been intended for charitable works and emergency assistance. Instead, a significant portion had been redirected into private financial interests. The records showed money moving into luxury apartments in London and private investment portfolios controlled through layers of ownership. In one case, church funds had financed a vineyard in Tuscany owned by the nephew of a cardinal. Each new document connected an act of personal benefit to money that had entered the Vatican under the promise of serving the poor. What had first appeared to be a collection of irregular transactions was now taking the shape of a sustained system. Archbishop Thomas Kwame Ansa was the first person in the room to speak after reviewing the evidence. He told the Pope that he had reported anomalies in the Peter's Pence accounts 3 years earlier and had been assured that the discrepancies were clerical errors. The following week, his deputy had been reassigned. Pope Leo XIV leaned forward and answered with complete restraint. "They will not reassign anyone this time." The evidence on the oak table had already established theft, concealment, and institutional protection. Pope Leo XIV understood that removing a few officials would not be enough. He had studied the pattern left by earlier reform attempts, and the pattern was always the same. A scandal was contained, several names disappeared from public view, and the machinery beneath them remained untouched. He did not want another private cleanup managed through sealed meetings and carefully limited statements. He did not want quiet resignations followed by new appointments that preserved the same habits under different faces. Every closed reform had eventually allowed the institution to protect itself from the full consequences of what had happened. Leo believed that secrecy was no longer containing the crisis, it was sustaining it. He told the 6 people in the basement room that he wanted the Vatican's financial books opened to independent examination. Every account, transaction, investment, and disbursement from the previous 25 years would be made available for review. The disclosure would not be controlled through a slow release shaped by the Vatican press office. An outside commission would receive the authority to examine the records and publish its conclusions without submitting them to the Pope for prior approval. The room fell silent as the scale of the proposal became clear. Sister Mariana Vega was the first to respond, warning that no institution of comparable size had voluntarily exposed its internal finances to that degree. Leo did not hesitate. "Good," he said. "Then we will be the first." Cardinal Matteo Bruni offered the strongest resistance inside the team. He remained loyal to the Pope, but he understood the alliances that held the Vatican together and the bishops who controlled powerful dioceses across Europe and North America. He warned that Leo could lose cardinals who had supported his election and provoke a fracture within the Church itself. The Pope looked directly at him and answered, "A church that protects its thieves does not deserve unity." At that moment, the investigation changed its purpose. It was no longer limited to identifying the 14 men named in the documents or recovering money from private accounts. Leo had chosen to place the institution itself under examination, including the structures that had allowed the network to operate for years. The decision would define his papacy before the decree had even been written. By the evening of May 14th, the 6-person team had converted the Pope's decision into the first draft of a formal decree. The document carried the title Lumen Punier, meaning light of money. It was not written as a symbolic statement or a promise of future reform. Every provision created an immediate obligation, a fixed deadline, or a direct loss of authority. The first provision established an independent Vatican Financial Transparency Commission composed of 7 members. 4 of those members would be lay professionals with no previous Vatican affiliation. The intended appointments included forensic accountants, anti-corruption lawyers, and a former head of a European central bank. Their independence was essential because Leo did not want the commission absorbed into the same institutional structure it had been created to examine. The second provision ordered the digitization of every Vatican financial record from the preceding 25 years. All accounts, investments, transfers, and disbursements covered by the decree had to be made available to the Commission within 90 days. A public summary of the Commission's findings would follow within 6 months. The timetable prevented Vatican offices from delaying the process until public pressure had passed. The third provision carried the greatest institutional force. All 14 cardinals named in the leaked documents would be suspended from official duties while a full canonical investigation proceeded. The suspension did not declare them guilty, but it removed their ability to influence offices, personnel, records, or decisions connected to the inquiry. Power that had taken decades to accumulate could disappear the moment the decree entered into force. Suspending one cardinal would have shaken the Vatican. Suspending 14 at the same time meant confronting several networks of loyalty in a single act. Some of the men had supported Leo's election, while others controlled relationships extending through Europe, North America, and the Roman Curia. The provision was the point at which financial reform became an open struggle over who still possessed authority inside the Church. The team reviewed the language line by line as the evening advanced. Sister Mariana Vega examined the canonical basis for the suspensions. Luca Ferretti checked that the financial mandates covered the records already identified, and Archbishop Thomas Kwame Ansa focused on access to the internal systems that had previously resisted his audits. Cardinal Matteo Bruni understood what the final pages would mean politically. Once Leo placed his signature beneath them, no private compromise could make the decision disappear. Pope Leo XIV signed Lumen Punier at 11:22 in the evening on May 15, 2026. The final pages lay on the desk before him as he placed his name beneath the decree that suspended 14 cardinals and opened 25 years of Vatican financial activity to independent review. No public announcement accompanied the signature. The order moved first through sealed paper, controlled delivery, and direct authority. By midnight, couriers had hand-delivered sealed copies to every cardinal residing in Rome. Each envelope carried the same decree, the same suspensions, and the same deadlines. The documents reached private quarters before the Vatican press office had prepared any explanation for the outside world. Inside the walls, the implications were understood immediately. At 1 in the morning, telephones began ringing across the Vatican without pause. Cardinals contacted one another, aides moved between rooms, and offices that should have been dark became active. Some recipients demanded legal clarification, while others tried to learn which names appeared in the evidence. The decree had been signed in silence, but its arrival created an institution-wide alarm. By 2 in the morning, 3 of the suspended cardinals had attempted to leave Vatican City. Their movements transformed the situation from internal resistance into an immediate security problem. The Swiss Guard received instructions to close the exits and prevent unauthorized departure. What followed was described outwardly as protocol, but inside the Apostolic Palace it felt like containment. At 3:47 in the morning, the doors of the Apostolic Palace were sealed. Armed Swiss guards stood at the exits, and the cardinals inside were ordered not to leave the building, the city, or their private quarters. The authority behind the lockdown did not come from a temporary security command. It came directly from the Pope, who had signed the decree only hours earlier. The physical closure of the palace revealed the true force of Leo's decision. 14 men who had exercised influence across the Church were no longer being asked to cooperate with an inquiry. Their authority had been suspended, their movements were being monitored, and their first attempts to leave had failed. Before dawn, the Vatican had entered a confrontation unlike any produced by a routine financial investigation. Cardinal Enzo Moretti was 73 years old and had served inside the Vatican for more than 4 decades. He was connected to nearly every major center of influence in the Church and had helped negotiate the compromises that contributed to Leo's election. When the Swiss Guard informed him that he could not leave his quarters, he refused to accept the order as legitimate. "I answer to God, not to a bureaucrat from Chicago," he reportedly said. Within an hour, Moretti had organized a conference call with 6 other suspended cardinals. The men discussed whether to issue a joint public statement declaring the decree invalid under canon law. Others proposed appealing directly to the College of Cardinals and demanding an emergency consistory. The discussion was no longer about financial procedure alone, because the suspended men were searching for a way to challenge the Pope's authority before the decree became irreversible. One participant proposed a far more dangerous response. The unnamed cardinal, widely believed to be a senior figure in the Roman Curia, suggested preparing a formal petition questioning the validity of Leo's papacy itself. The idea surfaced at approximately 3 in the morning on May 16th. It did not become a public campaign, but its appearance inside the call revealed how quickly the confrontation had moved beyond suspension and into the foundations of papal legitimacy. Pope Leo XIV remained awake while the cardinals organized against him. He had left his study and entered the chapel of the Domus Sancti Marthae, where he sat alone in the front pew. The palace around him was under restriction, telephones were active in private quarters, and senior church officials were testing the limits of the decree. Leo showed no visible sign that he intended to reverse his decision. At 4 a.m, Sister Mariana Vega entered the chapel to brief him on the movements of the suspended cardinals. She told him that they were organizing and that Moretti was calling in favors from dioceses throughout Italy. Leo answered that he already knew. When she warned that the situation could spiral beyond their control, he remained calm and told her that the crisis had already begun. "The question is whether it spirals toward truth or back into darkness," Leo said. "I have made my choice." Sister Vega stood before him with the latest reports while the opposition continued to form behind closed doors. By the time she left the chapel, the Pope understood that the resistance would not end with private objections. The next battle would begin when the outside world learned what had happened inside the Vatican. By dawn on May 16th, the Vatican press office was still trying to prepare an official explanation for the decree. It had not controlled the first report, and it had not controlled the timing. At 5:14 in the morning, Italian investigative journalist Giulia Ferrara published a story based on information from sources inside the Swiss Guard. The headline announced that Pope Leo XIV had suspended 14 cardinals in a midnight financial purge. The report spread across international networks within minutes. By 7 in the morning, it had become the lead story on every major news channel in the world. Images of sealed Vatican entrances appeared beside reports of suspended cardinals, armed guards, and an unexplained financial decree. The crisis was no longer contained inside private quarters, basement meetings, or sealed envelopes. Reaction divided almost immediately. Reform advocates and liberal Catholics described the decree as the most courageous papal action since the Second Vatican Council. Conservative commentators called it a concentration of power disguised as moral reform. European bishops issued carefully controlled statements supporting financial transparency while avoiding direct endorsement of the decree itself. Catholics in the United States divided along familiar political lines, but the strongest reaction came from bishops in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. Many of their parishes had contributed to Peter's pence, even when local communities could barely afford electricity, food programs, or building repairs. Their anger was not directed primarily at the Pope. It was directed at the cardinals accused of taking money given by believers who had almost nothing to spare. A joint statement from the Bishops' Conference of Sub-Saharan Africa described the alleged theft as a betrayal of the faithful that cried out to heaven for justice. The Archbishop of Lagos reduced the entire scandal to one sentence: "Our people gave what they could not afford to give, and it was taken from them by men in silk." The statement carried more force than the cautious language emerging from European dioceses. It placed the suffering of ordinary donors at the center of the crisis. That shift changed the public meaning of the decree. The story was no longer only about papal authority, canonical procedure, or a struggle among senior officials in Rome. It was about money taken from farmers, factory workers, grandparents, and poor parishes under the promise that it would serve people in need. By the time the Vatican prepared its official response, the moral judgment had already begun outside its walls. At 10 in the morning on May 16th, Cardinal Enzo Moretti entered the Pope's study and challenged the suspensions as a violation of due process. He argued that the documents could have been fabricated and urged Leo to send the case to the Apostolic Signatura. Leo listened for nearly 15 minutes before placing a bank statement on the desk. The document showed a transfer of 2.3 million euros from an account in Luxembourg to a company registered in Moretti's nephew's name. "Is this fabricated?" Leo asked. Moretti replied, "You do not understand how this place works." Leo answered, "I understand perfectly. That is why I am changing it." Moretti returned to his quarters, but the resistance continued. 7 cardinals demanded that Lumen Punier be withdrawn, warning that public disclosure would damage the Church and create legal danger. Leo answered with one handwritten line, "The Church's credibility is not damaged by truth, it is damaged by the fear of truth." At 6 in the evening, Archbishop Thomas Kwame Ansa gave the first official briefing. He confirmed that 412 million euros had been diverted across 20 years through shell companies in 7 countries. He reminded the world that the money had come from farmers, factory workers, and grandmothers who trusted the Church to serve the poor. 73 million people watched the briefing live. The next day, Leo addressed a crowded St. Peter's Square and promised a fair canonical process while declaring that silence would protect no one. He announced that the commission would begin work within 2 weeks and publish its findings without exception. That evening, Sister Mariana Vega reported that 2 suspended cardinals were seeking political support in Italy and France to challenge the decree. Leo responded by inviting the Anti-Fraud Office of the European Union to observe the Commission's work. The move weakened the legal threat and drew public support from the Italian Prime Minister and the President of France. On May 18th, Leo allowed Cardinal Javier Herrera to return to Spain for medical treatment on the condition that he remain available to investigators. Meanwhile, Luca Ferretti discovered that the network may have financed political campaigns, influenced papal elections, and maintained loyalties across 3 continents. He warned that the operation had existed since at least 2002 and that the number of implicated cardinals might double. One financial trail appeared to lead toward a senior figure involved in the conclave that elected Pope Francis in 2013. Leo ordered every trail followed and warned Archbishop Ansa that the investigation could trigger the greatest crisis since the Reformation. The Commission then received unrestricted access to Vatican financial systems and archives, and Leo gave his final answer. "I am not worried about what they will find. I am worried about what they would not find if we never let them look." The investigation remained unfinished. The 14 suspended cardinals still awaited their canonical hearings. The Transparency Commission had only begun examining the records, and the unnamed senior figure connected to the conclave of 2013 remained under scrutiny. No one inside the Vatican could yet say how many additional names would appear or how far the financial network had reached. Pope Leo XIV continued living in the Domus Sanctae Marthae, sleeping only 4 hours each night and writing his reflections by hand. He still met with his small team beneath the Vatican Library as security tightened across the Apostolic Palace. After little more than a year as Pope, he had forced one of the oldest institutions in the Western world to examine the system it had protected for decades. His allies called him the most courageous pope in 5 centuries. His enemies called him reckless and accused him of endangering the Church he had sworn to defend. Leo understood that the investigation could destroy alliances, weaken confidence in the institution, and place his own papacy under permanent pressure. He continued because every alternative led back to the silence that had allowed the network to survive. On the night of May 15, 2026, Leo chose transparency over political survival and truth over institutional comfort. The doors of the Apostolic Palace were sealed for 1 night, but the financial system behind them had been opened to a scrutiny that could no longer be withdrawn. The world was watching, and whatever the commission uncovered next would change the church long after those doors reopened.